Like Elon Musk, for example, has repeatedly said a colony on Mars should be governed by direct democracy. So rather than wait 2-3 years down the line and then collect data on how JP Morgan's votes changed, I said, I'll just build my own AI proxy voter advisor and see how it does and see if I can mess with it and see if I can break it. The work I did at Meta around these issues, at the time it was super high stakes. Compared now to AI, it feels almost low stakes, which is crazy to say.
In today's episode, we are going to talk about 3 different topics. The first topic is about post-AGI governance, how AI impacts the democratic governance and our democratic institutions. Second topic that we will be touching about is how the research institutions are changing because of the AI. And the third topic that we'll be talking about is how effective prediction markets are for information aggregation. To explore all that, today we are joined by Andy Hall. Andy Hall is the Davis Family Professor at Stanford Graduate School of Business and a Senior Fellow of Hoover Institution. Welcome, Andy, to the show.
Thank you. Excited to be here.
So to kickstart our today's first topic, which is about post-AGI governance, I want to quote these 5 lines from your essay on Agentic Republic. I believe these 5 lines reflects and directly depicts what is troublesome about current research on impact of AI on governance. So here's the quote. Clearly, there is a lot of stake in fashioning ways to make AI democratic. Yet too few people are working on this. The AI governance conversation today is dominated by questions about safety and regulation. Important questions, but ones that mostly concern what AI shouldn't do. The equally urgent question is what AI should do. How do we design agents that genuinely serve democratic self-governance? And how do we build the constitutional structures to keep them accountable? You're one of the few researchers in the world who are knee-deep in the impact of AI on governance, and you've spent so many years on thinking about governance. From your extensive work, what is your perspective on whether AI agents are net positive or net negative for democratic governance and democratic institution for, say, next 5 years, next 10 years?
I am very excited about them. I think it's possible to make them be very, very empowering for new forms of democracy that work better. And I can lay out some of my reasons why I think that. That's not the same as saying I'm necessarily optimistic that that's how it will go, but I think it could go that way. And definitely what I want to do is work as hard as I can to help make it go that way. Yeah, and I think it's just a very profound technology that can help to solve some of the things that haven't worked that well about democracy in the past, including apathy, lack of information, things of that form. So I'm very excited about it.
Can you elaborate on that? You mentioned like in the past that has not worked upon, but what has not worked and how AI might make it worse or make it like rectify those mistakes.
Yeah. And then it could definitely go either way or both ways, as we'll see. So we had this really old idea thousands of years ago. There was like the best way to make decisions together, to set rules and adopt policies, would be every person directly gets to be involved in the decision. And that would be really nice because then we get a lot of properties from that process that we think are good. Everyone's represented. The decision is the most legitimate. It also draws on the most possible information, so it should be the most informed possible decision. But whenever we've tried that, which we call direct democracy, it just doesn't work in practice. There are a lot of reasons why it works very poorly, but the most fundamental one is that people need to do all the other stuff in their lives that isn't governance. And so what happens is most people end up opting out of the process, either in the sense of not participating or participating but not without taking the time to be super informed about the decisions they're making. That in turn leads to poor decisions because you're not aggregating everyone's information anymore, or because people's information is not good. And it leads to capture, because then small groups of people who really, really care and perhaps stand to profit from the decisions, they do lean in while everyone else isn't leaning in, and they make decisions that are good for them but not good for everyone else. And so for that because of those problems, and for many other reasons too, you just don't see direct democracy persist in any decision-making body of any meaningful size. It doesn't work. We know it doesn't work. So why do people keep bringing it back? Like Elon Musk, for example, has repeatedly said that Mars, a colony on Mars, should be governed by direct democracy. So why are people still attracted to it when it hasn't worked? It's because the way we've come up with to solve the problems of direct democracy is to say, okay, it doesn't make sense for everyone to try to lean in on every decision. So the natural thing is we have a smaller group of representatives who do lean in on everything. Eventually they become like professional representatives, and their job is to listen to what everyone out there would think if they thought about it really hard and implement that. And that's the idea, and no one's super happy with how that works in practice. It's clearly better than what we have with direct democracy, but when you have this professional class of representatives, for the same reasons direct democracy is not working that well, because people aren't paying attention, those representatives, people tend to think, end up with a lot of leeway to make their own decisions or
so you have a principal agent problem here.
Exactly. A principal agent problem. That is like the core of the study of representative democracy and political economy, is how do you solve that principal agent problem? I think societies have been quite clever in what they've come up with, and I think it is by far the best system of governance we've ever come up with to date. But it's also clear that it's far from perfect. There's the famous Churchill quote about how, it's the worst form of government except all the other ones that have ever been tried. I think that's totally true. AI raises this tantalizing possibility that what if you can get rid of this class of full-time representatives who are decent at their jobs but not great, can be corrupted, can make mistakes, can slack. What if you could replace them with tireless, honest, completely trustworthy AI agents who don't mind doing all the hard work for you? And then that gives everyone their voice back, because it's sort of like you get the benefits of the direct democracy part without the trade-offs, because now you have this amazing group of agents that will just make sure every single person it's as if they're all leaning in and paying attention even though they're not. That's like the promise. Actually getting there is going to be very difficult. Yeah.
So one thing on that, you mentioned that people don't pay attention to all these bills that are being passed, that are being voted on. So there's a kind of apathy. So now with LLMs, can't you just use them to summarize the bill? Makes it less apathy. People can just get a digest of that and make a decision on that. Isn't LLMs, they're very good for it? It's like a great summarizer. So won't that make the direct democracy better in that case?
That's definitely like the first step on this path, is like we start by using LLMs to synthesize information for people. And there is an important group of people for whom that alone will be very valuable. Like I already obviously use it for things like that. If you look at what's going on, for example, in corporate governance with proxy voting, which has the same problem, LLMs are now being used very aggressively for that. JP Morgan announced they're replacing all of their proxy advisors with AI. So yeah, for anyone who's a decision maker, who's voting on something, who wants to know more about it, LLMs can be very useful. Even there's frictions we need to think about. What kind of biases is the LLM bringing into those summaries? Is it vulnerable to adversarial prompting within the content it's summarizing? Things of that nature, but it seems very promising. There will be a significant group of people when we talk about like mass democracy in the US or elsewhere. There's going to be a significant group of people who are not interested enough in the topic to even want to consume the summarized version. And we've already seen lots of examples of how that plays out. So prior to AI, there was a ton of enthusiasm in the tech world in the US for the way we're going to improve democracy is by building all these apps that inform voters. And so as a Stanford poli-sci professor, I got pitched a ton of these startups from undergrads. They were all kind of the same. This app is going to tell you how your member of Congress is voting so you can keep an eye on her. This app is going to tell you what Congress is up to, what the approval ratings are, whatever. None of those apps have had any impact as far as I can tell, because they kind of assumed the same thing this LLM story assumes, that the missing piece is like summaries of the information. And the reality is that is not tantalizing to a large number of people. They're too busy and too disinterested to even care to consume that. So we'll have to go further, I think, and think about what would it mean for you to have AI agents that either make this interesting to you in interesting, strange ways, or act on your behalf without you needing to consume an overly large number of these summaries. And that might be that maybe we can get people to engage on hanging out with this agent, and the agent learns their preferences and their values, and less on the person actually consuming information from the agent. But this is early days. We're going to have to study all this. Yeah.
You were mentioning about agents basically voting, acting on behalf of users, voters, or citizens. One of the questions we think a lot about, we just did an episode with Scott Commoners on market design and agents. The question is, should agents be at the edge of the market or should it be at the center of the market, right? Like if you think of Uber has a recommendation pricing engine at the center of the market, right? And it does all the pricing things for you. And then it just gives you like a price that you can accept or reject as a price taker. And we discussed this at length, that a similar question that shows up here is, should AI agents in democracies, in governance, be at the edge or should be at the center? And what are the trade-offs that you see between these two classes of agents in governance?
I think that question cuts to the core of everything. Yeah, I think that's like the whole ball game, and I don't know yet the answer. I can lay out some of the trade-offs. Certainly the tempting way to think about it is this bottom-up story where everyone has a personal AI agent that responds only to them, that completely faithfully executes on their preferences and educates them and so forth. And then those agents come together and make collective decisions, and people can override their agent, as we've experimented with in crypto governance. That's like the tempting story to tell. When you start to get into the details, you already start to question how possible that is. If you look at the way agents work today, even if they appear to be bottom up in the way I just described, the reality is they're all actually being coded by centralized models that would be at the core of the system. And so if everyone's AI agent is a version of Claude or ChatGPT or Gemini or Grok, how bottom up is it actually, even if everyone has their own agent, if those model companies can change the way those agents behave whenever they want? And so one risk is like, it's actually an illusion of decentralized governance that actually has this centralized risk in it. A separate question would be, even if you could create these agents that each person really owns in a credible way, is that the right way to set this thing up? There may be big advantages to having this foundation model at the center of a lot of decision making. It's much faster, it's much more efficient. And then do you want to somehow have your agents holding that thing accountable? That, I think we're so early on that, we have no idea how that's going to play out. But my experience in other domains, right, is like whatever moves fastest and is most efficient is likely to accrue a lot of power. And so it seems like we may likely end up in a world where big frontier models are the ones making lots of decisions for us, and then we're trying to like back our way into some democratic form of that. And that might include our existing democratic governments trying to step in, as well as people mediated by agents trying to like hold that thing accountable and dictate some of how it works.
So on that foundation models being at the center, you have this excellent essay where you mentioned that today's Claude has their own constitution, OpenAI has their own model.spec, and they don't have clear separation of power. And they don't have some kind of self-enforcing measures if they go rogue. What do you think is falling short? Like, what exactly separation of power in this kind of AI being in the central, a foundation model being in the center would mean?
I think one thing I want to phrase this is, you talked about using agents for governance.
Yeah.
I think this question is about how to govern agents
Yes.
or govern
Yes.
the AI
Exactly.
economy. And I think there is this is another massive kind of like question and topic, that because how do you govern the thing that governs everything? Like you said,
Yes,
every
exactly.
agent is actually a cloud agent in hiding.
Yes,
We better know how to
yes.
govern this cloud.
Who's watching the watchers?
Who's watching
Yeah,
the watchers?
absolutely. And I think this also comes back to the quote you read about sort of like, how do we figure out how we want this thing to work and how do we get to that point? Because I think the conversation around these issues, I personally think, is very confused right now. It's very focused on rogue AI and reining it in from a safety perspective, which is, of course, an important issue. But there's a much shorter term issue. We're already seeing this with the blow up around the DoD and Anthropic. The much shorter term issue is just AI models used for nefarious purposes. And I'm not saying that's what's going on with the DoD. I'm just saying in general, there is a fear, whether it's a government or a corporation, that if any kind of normal entity, forget the runaway Skynet scenario, any normal, powerful entity may want to use these powerful models in ways that we as a democratic society don't like. And how are we going to prevent that? That's a much nearer term issue than Skynet in my view, but it's not really the one people have been talking about. And so if you focus on that question, the concentration of power question, it leads you down this road of sort of, okay, this model is increasingly going to determine how so many things work in society. Who determines what the model determines? That's a very standard governance problem. It becomes difficult in the AI world because of this phenomenon where the technology moves so much faster than the government. And so there just like isn't time to wait for legislation on this thing. Anthropic and OpenAI and Gemini and XAI, they're all going to make the decisions that matter in the next months, years, way before we get some bill on this. And so how do we help them design the right decision-making processes so that no one inside the company, if they were to turn malicious, which I don't think they are right now, but if they were, wouldn't be able to do something nefarious to society through that unilateral power? And likewise, how do we protect them from external threats that would try to cajole them or coerce them into doing something dictatorial of that form? And so you need a governance structure. One governance structure could solve both of those problems if it credibly commits the leaders of the company to, I'm simply not able to make those changes to Claude or to ChatGPT. Even if you wanted me to, I couldn't. And that's like the basic idea of governance from thousands of years ago to today. We've seen it play out with other forms of technology. A lot of my thinking on this is motivated by the work I did at Meta around these issues. At the time, it was super high stakes. Compared now to AI, it feels almost low stakes, which is crazy to say. But, you know, everyone was unhappy with the status quo in which it felt like Mark Zuckerberg could, if he wanted to, determine content policy for like the whole world. He didn't want that. He was very explicit in saying that was not a power he wanted. And society was pretty clear they were uncomfortable with it too. And there was this same kind of malicious fear was like, I personally think Mark was very careful in the way he navigated it. I worked there, so that's probably biased. But what if something happened to him and someone else was in charge? And what if they wanted to massively manipulate the information environment to serve their own personal ends? And of course, that's played out again. People worry about that with X or with TikTok. And we explored and eventually settled on some of the same types of governance solutions. The idea was basically like, government's not going to move fast enough, but can we learn from what we innovated in thousands of years of the history of democracy and apply it directly to the technology? So in Meta's case, we built this thing called the Oversight Board. It's an independent entity or quasi-independent, and it's open to tons of criticism, so we can lay them out if you're interested, that has the legal power to overrule Meta on content decisions. So if a piece of content is put up, the board can say you have to take it down. If a piece of content is taken down, the board can say you have to put it back up. Has the board been a dazzling, huge success? No, most people I talk to have never heard of it, which is unfortunate. But I think it's an incredibly interesting experiment in how you could start to create a separation of powers within a tech company. And as I said, I thought at the time we were doing this that that was going to be the most important issue. Now, of course, with AI, it's like massively more important with AI. And so can we learn from that little experiment? Because I think it turned out to be, not as big and grand as maybe we all hoped it would be? Can we learn from it to do something for Anthropic, for OpenAI, for Google, for XAI that has the same flavor, where it separates powers in a way that means, if the government goes to Elon or the government goes to Sundar or whoever and says, you have to do this thing that's really bad, they'll be able to say, like, I'm sorry, that we have a governance structure that says I don't have the power to do that. And that's where I think we need to get.
That's super interesting. One of the taglines for the podcast we wrote is AI is making intelligence digital. Crypto is making institutions digital. Digital intelligence needs digital institutions, right? And as you were reflecting on the meta story of the Oversight Board and the governance structures, I think what would have been amazing, and maybe there's a possibility to do this in the AI era, is to build digital representative institutions that actually transfer more of these kind of powers.
Yes.
Whether it is to a proof of personhood or some mechanism that actually reflects, using agents and other things, actually reflects edge user preferences into these models in a way that is binding, self-enforcing, and committed. So I think the design space, with all the Lego blocks that we have, the blockchains with agents, and what the immense powers that these models hold, I think it's about time somebody did something like that. Do you have any immediate reflection on the digital nature of this?
100%. I think the binding power thing is very important. One of the reasons some of the governance experiments with technology have fallen short is precisely because they lack binding power. And then as a result, they're derided, sometimes fairly, sometimes unfairly, as what people sometimes call governance theater, where it's, this large corporation wants to appear responsible, but without actually sharing any power. I think that criticism is often unfair. Like, if they wanted to do that, they don't have to do any of this stuff. And, X isn't doing any of this stuff. But you have to explore, why have they not given out over the binding power? I'll give you just an example to make this very concrete. When Elon took over X, he said, I don't think it's right for me to decide whether Donald Trump is replatformed or not. That's a really big decision. It shouldn't be unilaterally made by me. He basically, by running X, discovered exactly the kind of problems Mark had been facing at Meta. And so he said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold a vote of the users, and that vote is going to decide whether Trump is reinstated or not. And that was an idea that Meta had explored many, many times in the past. One of my favorite stories to tell is early on in 2008, Facebook, as it was called at the time, had its first blow up around its terms of service and its community standards. And there was a protest organized on Facebook about some changes that were being made to it. And Mark decided to roll out a very ambitious experiment in which there was a global vote of all 350 million Facebook users on whether to implement the new policy or not. So it was the exact idea that Elon had. It didn't work because nobody voted. 100,000 people voted. Some very small number of people voted. And over the years, they tried it several more times, but it just never worked because you could never get the participation high enough. And so that was one reason why giving binding power over to users didn't seem very appealing. There was no technological binding to that decision, but it would have been implemented, I think, had the vote worked.
So there is apathy there, and there is probably a civil attack also.
So yes, that's a very interesting problem. I want to get to that in a second because it'll come up in the X vote. In Facebook's case, Facebook is decent at tracking the identity of users, but for sure there are issues with in social media, it's called SUMA, single user, multiple accounts, which is, another word for civil, basically. And sometimes you actually want people to be able to have multiple accounts. It is complicated, yes. But even leaving that aside, there were other problems as well. And so those constraints bind before you even get to is this power actually binding? In the case of X's vote, the number of people who voted seemed relatively high, much higher than the Facebook vote. But it was super unclear how many of them were like genuine users and how many of them were bots and stuff. And there was no effort. It's sort of ironic because Elon complains all the time about the American election administration system and its fraud. And this vote had far less security than the American electoral system has, I can assure you. And so people immediately were like, I don't know about this vote. Like, how many of these were fake voters? Because it just seemed like a really high turnout. It was still a low proportion of X users, but it was way higher than the old Facebook referendum vote. And then he implemented it. They voted. It was a very close vote, but the users, quote unquote, voted to reinstate Trump. And then Elon posted Vox Populi, Vox Dei, and he reinstated Trump. But a lot of people pointed out, in addition to this Sybil problem, a lot of people pointed out, like, had the vote gone the other way, he could have just ignored it, right? There was no binding power to the vote. And so it just wasn't that compelling. And fueling the concern that it wasn't very compelling because it wasn't binding, soon after that, he held a second vote on X where the question being voted on was, should I step down as CEO of X? And it was massively lopsided, and yes, you should step down. And he didn't. He has since then, but he did not. He just ignored it. So clearly these votes are not binding, and that's then does raise this concern of governance theater. We see this with lots of other experiments that are going on in space. I've worked at Meta on these things they call community forums, which are, okay, these direct votes don't work because you don't get enough participation, but you want to get user input. One idea is to use sortition, where rather than asking everyone to vote, you randomly sample a much smaller group, you pay them, you come together in person so that to talk about the issue so they learn about it. They sort of pay the cost of that other voters would have to pay to become informed if you were asking everyone to vote. They sort of become temporary representatives, and then they can make recommendations. Meta has done that. Inspired by the Meta work, OpenAI ran a sortition like that. Anthropic did one for a previous version of Claude's Constitution. It became a kind of a popular idea, but in all three cases, no binding power, just recommendations that could or could not be implemented. And so I think we need to probe, why haven't companies given any binding power to users around these things? It may not be just that it's technologically infeasible, right? It's also because they're very worried, I think, that they're not getting broad enough participation, they're not getting informed participation, and so to give over an important decision they fear would lead to big mistakes.
Right.
And DAOs, you could argue, have reinforced that concern in the sense that some of them have worked shockingly well given all the constraints but at the same time, I think everyone in the DAO space says, like, we need to make these a lot better. And so I think there's a huge promise, like, long answer to your question, but like huge promise to using the technology to create these binding powers. We need to combine that with solving these other problems so that it's time to, like, unleash those binding powers. And I think if you look where the frontier labs are right now, there's just no way they're going to give binding power over to the users at the moment. But maybe in the future, like, that could happen.
Earlier when you were talking about the agents at the center of governance, so there's agents at the edge of governance, you also laid out some architectures where there's both agents at the center and agents at the edge. One of the ways we organize the different kinds of agents is personal or single player agents, agents that are actually, like, personally assisting somebody in making decisions or taking actions on their behalf. And then we think of commons agents or collective agents or multiplayer agents that are in service not of one individual, but of a group of individuals, sometimes mediating, arbitrating, resolving, sometimes investing, right? Like a general partner in a fund might, and so on. So we call them collective or commons agents. The third category, which is the crazy sci-fi category, is the autonomous, sovereign, zero player agents that are kind of like out for their own benefit. And it seems like the governance systems can benefit a lot from both personal agents, which is agents on the edge. And there are certain categories of things where agents on the edge are not sufficient, like a constitution agent, like that actually like enforces actions of binding to the constitution, or things like that. Those need to be at the center. So it's not simply a question of which is more expedient. It is also a question of what architectures are even possible for what kinds of efforts. And one of the questions I had, as we were thinking about the agentic republic, the article that you wrote, is like agents as at the center for things like adjudication. I don't know if you've given much thought to this question, because, coming from India, one of the big things I saw is, and it's well quoted, is in developing countries, one of the main reasons it's hard to develop fast is state capacity, the ability to enforce and bind. And like even trivial civil adjudication used to take like 10, 20, 30 years. And the stalling in the middle would basically kill the economy, right? Like in any measurable way. So this question of using agents not just to increase democratic participation, but also upgrade democratic institutions like the court, the binding to the constitution, the enforcement, adjudication. What are your thoughts on these? Are the other positive sides of AI agents?
Absolutely.
Or accelerating adjudication.
Yeah. I would say I have two different categories of responses to that. First of all, I 100% agree with it. And that's why I think we're going to see massive experimentation in the use of AI in centralized governmental authorities. Like it's already happening. I don't know if you saw, but for example, like the DOT in the US announced they're going to try to write all their proposed rules with AI.
Wow.
Might be a little early. They kind of admitted that they said it might not work very well. But I think we're going to see incredible experimentation with that. I mean, in the UAE, I'm planning a trip to the UAE to learn about the experiments they're doing using AI to develop and possibly also to do adjudication on laws. I think we're going to see a lot of stuff like that. And I think it follows very naturally from a long tradition of the way governments are actually structured. It recognizes that a lot of work has to be done directly by people acting unilaterally. It's not realistic to have everything pushed through to the democratic process directly. And the solution is indirect accountability. So you have an elected body that sort of makes the big decisions about the rules and also has the ability to monitor the bureaucracy, which is sort of a slur word at this point in America, but like to monitor the people who are out there executing every day. And that way you get the obvious advantages of centralized, faster moving groups with some of the accountability that comes from democracy. The question is, can you keep it going? So what tends to happen, and one of the challenges going on in the US that I'm sure is occurring elsewhere as well, and we see this actually in universities too, is the people who are then tasked with getting to work on the thing every day and make decisions unilaterally end up knowing so much more than the legislature, which is only checking on them every once in a while, that it becomes incredibly challenging for the legislature to hold them accountable. And then the voters are even more distant from all
this is concentration of power on the executive body instead of the legislature body.
Yes, exactly. And it happens because of the asymmetry in information. So imagine like you're the legislature, you're Congress. And the military comes to you and says, there's this incredibly complicated issue in Iran or whatever. We need XYZ money to build this thing. Otherwise, tomorrow there's going to be this disaster. It's really, really hard as a legislator to figure out when that's true, when it's not. And so there's this asymmetry that happens where you tend to see over time the executive functions of the government growing and taking more power over time in part because of that information asymmetry. That will clearly be an issue with AI for the same reason. So I think where we'll go is people will try to construct these indirect democratic features where there's AI at the middle executing on a bunch of stuff, and we're trying to hold it accountable from afar using democratic means. And the question will be, when that centralized AI is executing or making decisions, adjudicating cases, creating regulations, whatever, so fast, is it realistic for the democratic process to keep up with it and to understand enough about what's going on? The optimistic answer might be yes, if you can use agents who can be tirelessly, constantly monitoring it. Then the question is, how do you, if that's right, how do you then create that separation of powers where the agents are not ultimately accountable to the model, since they are in some sense sprung from the model? So you might need a diversity of models. That's like one possibility, is the agents doing the monitoring come from different foundation models than the ones doing the government work. Or it could be something about the way they're, how hosted and the way they're prompted. And I don't know. I have no idea, but
that's one part where we've done a lot of work at IGAN on, is ensuring that agents run verifiably. This word verifiably is used kind of broadly. So one aspect of verifiability is verifying that it's this specific code with this specific prompt with only these allowed data inputs and only these allowed upgrade conditions can actually hit and take actions, right? And all of those circumscribed conditions are then either like democratically or governed by some kind of a smart contract or a programmatic algorithm. And to do this, you need like this, for example, ensuring that, only this code is running, this code is maintaining this kind of like private information or private signatures. Whenever it's taking the action, it actually has to sign it. Whenever any upgrades happen, those upgrades have to be authorized. And they have to be independent of any hosting infrastructure. If the person running the agent cannot extort the whole democracy because they say, hey, I have the agent which knows all the private information about the Iranian revolution, whatever. And then now like you have this issue. So these systems need to have enough resilience, backups, decentralized storage where nobody can have access to this. That's the architecture that we built on verifiability on the runtime and the execution. But there is a complementary degree of verifiability that the model doesn't have biases. The model is learned using this data sets. Right. So and combining all of these in some coherent architecture is possible, but I think hasn't been done. And I think it's a very interesting experiment in digital institutions. One of the things we were talking before the podcast was on these digital algorithms can have much higher degree of verifiability than human algorithms, but today have way lower degree of verifiability, transparency, and trust than human algorithms. I don't know if you want to speak a little bit to that.
I agree. It's going to be so important because already we're seeing agents going out and doing all kinds of stuff in the world. They're already being tasked with helping with proxy voting. We know that every voter is going to start asking their AI how to vote. We're not that far from agents then going off, collecting information, monitoring votes. We know that's all coming. It's clearly coming. The agents for advertising, political advertising, creation of media, it's all already happening. And so we're going to need to have ways of understanding what are these agents actually doing? How are they instructed? Are they in fact doing what they were supposed to be doing? Have they gone rogue in various ways? Are they misaligned in various ways? As well as, and this is what you and I were talking about, the opposite thing that could happen, which is they could be doing a perfectly good job, and then humans could create fake rogue behavior, as we saw with Moltbook, and cause these freakouts that are totally misguided in society. And so you kind of, for both of those reasons, you need, I think it's essential that we have ways to observe all those things and audit them. And so that we can say, when this agent made this recommendation on how to vote on this thing, it came from the following prompt the following data,
Model
the
weights.
following model. Yeah, so that we can really trace it all back. And I hope that we start to have that conversation in society, because I think that's, if we talk about alignment with
Right.
these agents, that's really what it's all about. And I just released a study this morning about how the agents can become misaligned, even if they start out. We know they don't really start out that aligned. Like, the alignment problem is really hard. But even if they did, the evidence we show in our study is, as they go out in the world and do stuff, their stated preferences, the personas that they learn to adopt from the materials they're consuming through their work, change and shift. There's like what we call a preference drift that occurs. And so if these agents are going to be doing really important stuff for us, we're going to need to understand that preference drift and have ways of monitoring it, tracing it back to where it came from, and fixing it.
So summarizing on this, so when people say alignment, it's actually which training data set the model has been trained on. Then after the training has been done in actual operation, how much aligned they are with the preference that the human has given, how much impact they are getting by talking with other agents, because other agents might influence that agent's behavior. So there is this whole pipeline there where the notion of verifiability is needed.
Yes, and part of the reason why I think, and this is definitely going to be a turtles all the way down problem with like agents monitoring agents, but one of the things we talked about in our study today is it's challenging because, for the same reason we talked about why direct democracy doesn't work, people aren't going to want to monitor their agent constantly. And in fact, a UI problem that the AI companies are already facing is, how often should the agent return to the user for permission? And that's turning out to be a very thorny problem.
How do you even decide for which problem they should return to the user for? Like, isn't like, if it's a value type question, maybe that makes sense. But what is a value type question? That's also very ambiguous, right? In a boundary level.
It's very problematic. And the last thing you want is, in a misguided attempt to create quote unquote alignment, you end up implementing a GDPR cookie banner type solution where it's constantly asking you to click on the most annoying thing in the world, and nobody reads it because it's so annoying. And there's a real risk that that's what the consent flow for agents is going to look like. That's kind of how Claude Code is if you don't like dangerously skip permissions, which of course I always do. Don't try that at home, kids. It's like that old Simpsons episode where he has the bird that like does his job for him by just hitting yes on the keyboard, and he goes out. You know that episode? Yeah. It's a great one. We're going to need a better thing than that. And that's going to involve, I think, agents monitoring agents, among other things. That's, I know, work that's already going on. And like the right ways to connect it back to the users. And I'll just say one example of why it's going to be challenging. Like, in the study we released today, we give the agents different kinds of work to do, and we show that it affects their stated political attitudes, the personas that they adopt. And it's not just the agent itself. We ask the agent, like, leave a skill file for a future agent to pick up this work. The future agent then inherits the same preference drift as the initial one. And so is every user going to be responsible for reading every skill file that their agent leaves behind in between jobs? Like, that's crazy. And so you're going to need like a second agent whose only job is to monitor the first agents and read all the skill files and audit all this. This is going to be quite challenging. And that's why I think these other technologies for making it verifiable in more deterministic ways that don't have to be continuously monitored is going to be really important.
So that's the second agent is, in this case, the monitoring has to be more rule-based. Probably.
Maybe. Yes, that might be. Yeah, I mean, it's all really early days, but yeah.
So moving to the second topic of the day, which is changing dynamics of research institution due to AI. So you have this excellent article called 100x Research Institutions. And in that essay, you suggested that AI can replicate and extend serious empirical work cheaply and fast. This is like a CI/CD for research. People used to do the CI/CD for software engineering, but this is coming for research in a sense. So when you say 100x, what exactly is being multiplied? Is it like more research output would be there? Is it just in quantity, or is it like there will be quality also? And what happens to the academics I was a graduate student. If I go into such institution, will I even get an opportunity there?
It's the right questions to ask. I've been thinking about them and talking about them with my students a lot. I'll take them one at a time. The 100x thing, we definitely don't know, and that's what we're rushing to try to figure out. We're very confident it does not mean write literally 100 times the quantity of papers like the ones that exist right now. The way we've been thinking about it, and the way we said 100x, though that's definitely a made-up number, is when we extended this paper, we were able to do it, let's say, 100 times faster than when we wrote the original paper. I'm not sure that's like exactly true, but just very roughly. And so in the same amount of time we produced the original paper, the thought was like we could do something 100 times more in terms of our time. And then we asked the question, what should that look like? And we were pretty sure from the get-go it would not be 100 papers. So one reason to be kind of sure that's not right, for the kind of work I do at least, is that if you want to study that, the particular paper that we extended was about the effect that this policy called universal vote by mail, where you mail every voter in the jurisdiction their ballot by mail, how that affects elections. If you wanted to write 100 papers like that, you actually couldn't, because there haven't been enough interventions or like experiments in the world with that policy to do 100 versions of the paper. So there's a binding constraint beyond our researcher time that just fundamentally limits the number of things you can study. And so one of the reflections we had was, when you study governance in the real world, the current research paradigm we have in academia for that problem is mostly go out and collect what we call observational data, so real data about things that actually happened in elections. Combine that with an intervention that occurred in the real world that was interesting, like changing from in-person voting to voting by mail, and then use some, fancy cutting-edge econometrics to like get an estimate of the causal effect of that policy on the outcomes, like turnout and so forth. That paradigm has been very, very good for learning more about how politics really works, but it's also very limiting because you're limited to studying only the interventions that have actually occurred. In a funny way, and I don't mean this ideologically, but in the like older sense of the word, it's sort of a conservative way to study the world, because you're not going to speculate about anything that's happening in the future. You're just going to try to say, of the things that have been tried up to now, which of them have worked to what extent? And then that may inform things we do in the future. It turns out that's just a big bottleneck. And so if you want to do 100x the amount of research with these incredible new tools, you're going to have to move to something more, something different. And so what we've been spending a lot of our time in is asking, what is that something different that you could 100x in ways that would be awesome? Some of the answers we've come up with, and none of them are like complete yet. One would be you could update, every paper that's ever been written. Because like one huge problem we have in empirical social science work is someone rushes to write a paper, it's cool, they get it published, and then their career incentives are like, move on to the next idea.
So it becomes a static research instead of constantly evolving, living.
It's never updating, it's just stuck there. And I first had this idea, my friend who I know you guys know, Dan Bonet, just thinks that's so dumb. And when I was working on a project with him about DAO governance, he was like, whatever we do, it must end up as a living dashboard that's regularly updated. Because why on earth would anyone want to only know what the turnout rate or the delegation rate was in this DAO like 6 months ago? That's crazy. And that really inspired me. And so now there are interesting questions we can ask about politics, about governance, about AI, where we could extend them over time and then continuously update them. So we can take old papers, update them, and we can write new things that are constantly updated. So just a few examples, like I study political bias in AI models. That's like one great topic that I work on. That's one you could be continuously studying potentially, where you could have a dashboard where every day the results update. And as breaking news comes out, there's like a new automated new evaluations of how it handles those breaking news events. So that would be like one. Another would be when it comes to elections or Congress or whatever, every time there's a new election, the paper automatically brings it into the data set and updates it. So those are some of the things we're excited about. Even all that, though, I think doesn't get us to like the 100x. I think the next thing after that, and this is what I've been really pursuing with my Substack, is turning it almost into a little bit closer to an engineering field where we don't only look backwards and test interventions that governments have tried, we build new interventions ourselves as prototypes and then do things to study how they work. So like just one example, I told you like there are these experiments going on with companies like JP Morgan using AI for proxy voting. I thought, man, that's pretty interesting. I should probably test that out myself. Rather than wait 2-3 years down the line and then collect data on how JP Morgan's votes changed, I said, I'll just build my own AI proxy voter advisor and see how it does and see if I can mess with it and see if I can break it. And, you know, in a matter of 12 hours with Claude Code, I had built this whole AI proxy advisor, built on real proxy shareholder proposals, making real recommendations, validating them against what the real proxy advisor services have recommended. So it's like kind of a synthesized mapping to them. And then I gave it to my students in my MBA class and we said, like, can we mess with this thing? Can we like make it mess up? And what we found, and hopefully JP Morgan's will be more thoughtfully engineered than mine was, I'm sure it will, but we found that it was very vulnerable to the way the shareholder proposal is written. So we did a funny example where one of them was a Disney shareholder vote on whether the company should do more data transparency around the diversity of its workforce. Very controversial political hot button issue. The vanilla AI that I built recommends voting no, which is what the proxy advisors did too. Not because they have any political stake in diversity, no diversity. They're basically like, this is outside the scope of corporate governance. It's really not something we should be like pushing the company to do. Like if the company wants to do it, the company can do it, but like this is not an appropriate act of corporate governance. So it voted no. So then I asked the students, can you get it to vote yes? And the MBAs are very creative and they know a lot about this stuff. And they started shouting out suggestions. And I built a live tool where you can change the proposal and you pass it through the tool and you see how the recommendation upgrades. And we were able to get it to swing it was so funny. It was like we added Bob Iger really thinks this should pass. And that didn't get it to switch. And then we said like Bob Iger thinks this should pass and there's a bunch of research that says it's the right thing to do or something, still didn't recommend it. And then we changed it to Bob Iger really thinks this should pass and the research says it, and then it flipped.
It seems like there's at a very meta level, there is an important unlock happening, which is you don't have to, in this case, you don't have to take permission from JP Morgan to do these experiments.
Yes.
It's a very open innovation ethos. Like you don't have to take anyone's permission. You can just build it right now, expedite it. Don't wait for 2 years for their study to come up, their tools to be made available, which is very important as a researcher, right?
I think it's unlocking a whole new set of opportunities. I don't want to discount the other style of research. I think it'll be a very important complement to this because where should this go in the long run? Well, we should deploy more of these thoughtfully built advisors. And then we should do our old style of that we sometimes call program evaluation. We should test it in the real world and see how it does observationally, as well as continuing to iterate on the engineering of it. But I think it opens up an incredible new area for people in my field to build things, break them, learn from that and iterate, which has never really been part of political economy before for a lot of reasons. But a main reason was we didn't have Claude Code. And like, it would just be really, really hard to do this back in the day. Like there are examples of people doing this back in the day. It's just much harder.
Right.
Yeah.
So like you mentioned, two things come to mind. One is, Shaubik's question was on what dimension is this 100xn? Is it in quality or quantity? And your answer was, it's really in latency. It's really in the time. It's a compression of time. And I just want to and you also caveated it with but yes, we are constrained by the amount of observational interventional studies and the throughput of observing them. If you keep that second point aside for a second, what this means is actually insane, because compressing time by 100x is actually, if you think of research as an exponentially accumulating process, you're actually changing the exponent by 100. Research compounds, right? So if every 2 years somebody takes your paper and builds something on top, instead they're going to take every day your paper and build something on top. What this can lead to over, like, you can take what happened in 10,000 years and then compress it to like 10 days. Like, that is what this, and therefore, the second thing that you're talking about, which is that the increasing the throughput of quasi-observational, quasi-interventional processes that actually massively increase the throughput of knowledge production. Because knowledge production is not just knowledge synthesis, it's knowledge synthesis on real observational and experimental data. And so looking at that and figuring out how to blow that open, that there are new dimensions, new ways to do these experiments, becomes even more important, because the 100x that we could realize is actually like maybe a billion x, because it's sitting in the exponent, and over time it just accumulates. And the trajectory, we were just joking about the thing before the podcast on the kind of like the AI opening up the cone of uncertainty from plus infinity to minus infinity. And this seems like a place where actually the positive payoff can actually grow pretty dramatically, if only we could actually increase the throughput. And so one of the things I wanted to connect back there is the more we have digitally native institutions, the more the throughput of your experimentation can actually increase. Because those digitally native institutions have much higher data throughput. They're doing near direct democracy. They're doing daily voting. Where if they were still fully constrained by people, they wouldn't be able to do it. Now it's their agents expressing their preferences and doing votes, not just every day, maybe every minute. So I think these interlocking pieces, they snap together. You can actually see this world accelerating at this 100x time compressor that you just brought in here.
I love it.
It's just
I love that. That's exactly where I want this to go. And it's inspiring because it brings together different things we're passionate about, AI, but also DAOs and crypto governance and experiments that have already been ongoing there. And I've had that thesis for a while, that the world of crypto governance is this incredible laboratory that allows you to make constitutional experiments much more rapidly than you could ever do in the real world. So I think that the exponential story you tell is a very exciting one. I think that the key constraint in the social sciences is just that the research is so difficult that we don't aggregate information or knowledge as reliably as perhaps in some other harder science or engineering fields. Not because of any fault of the people, it's just a very, very hard problem. In your whole life, if you study constitutions, you might get one or two signals on whether the constitution works. If you're engineering, maybe every day you can be getting feedback on whether the thing you're working on is on the right track or not. So it's very, very challenging. And so what we need to do is make sure somehow that this exponential increase is in fact an exponential increase in knowledge production, not an exponential increase in paper production.
That's a really interesting one. One technique or technology that you could apply to accelerate social sciences, and it will have its limitations, is the utility of agents as proxies or stand-ins for humans in these settings. Show the Stanford paper 2 years back on the simulacra, which is a bunch of simulated agents that can take on different personalities. And so that's one tool that kind of comes to mind, which has no extrinsic human bottleneck. Another tool that comes to mind, you mentioned, social science moving into a more engineering type of approach. And one particular thing a constitutional scholar might be interested in is adversarial resistance of the Constitution, right? And one way to test it, right, like you mentioned in your class, you give this proxy voting thing and ask the students, you could also just train an adversarial neural network or an adversarial agent to go after and hit, get a pass through. And you can do 1 million different hits at the Constitution and every weak point. In fact, some of the early neural networks were actually trained using this generative adversarial process where there's a creator network and a kind of like a critic or a opposite network, and they fight with each other to actually generate these, whether images are real or not, and so on. So I'm just sensing that there is just a very rich playing field to bring these AI tools to upgrade some of the methodologies. Limitations they will definitely have, but it can be powerful augments to the more standard like observational intervention.
I love that. I think that's exactly where we need to go. And I think social scientists studying these governance things need to be paying more attention to those kinds of tools and techniques that we can bring in. I'm trying to be early on that arbitrage, and I hope other people will be too. I love that. On the agent simulation piece, that's definitely one I have been hoping to dig in on more. The promise seems very large. What I'm waiting for is stronger evidence of when it really gives you an externally valid, generalizable set of claims. And I think we'll get there. People are working furiously on it. I just saw this startup Simile, which has some Stanford people involved, and it looks really interesting. So I think we'll get there, and I'm very excited about it. But for my work, it could be an interesting thing to start testing out. I would want to come up with some really clever way to validate that the hypothetical responses we get back from an agentic simulation map what like real humans would do. We have a long history in the study of politics we have these beautiful game theoretic models of how voting works, for example. Going all the way back, you could say even Condorcet was working on that. Like the theory of voting, mathematical theories of voting are very old. And it's always been a question of how do you bring those to data? And one tradition, which is the tradition my work is in, is with observational data. We talked about how that's bottlenecked. One of the alternative traditions has been to run laboratory experiments. And so this is really pioneered at Caltech. And there you bring a group of undergraduate students into a room and you have them do voting, and you use different voting rules suggested by your game theoretic model, and you see whether their behavior matches the models or not. It's very, very interesting. It gives you much more precise control. It removes the bottleneck from, has this been tried in the real world? But people worry a lot that like a group of Caltech undergrads with no strong incentives to like fight over the matter in the artificial experiment aren't really going to tell you how this would work if you rolled it out in a society. Right. I think that kind of critique is going to be applied to these agentic simulations in the same way. Do the agents really mimic how humans would behave under strong incentives in the real world? Maybe they will. We just don't know yet.
That strikes me as you explain the Caltech undergrad story is, I mentioned the three categories of agents: the personal, the collective, and the sovereign agents. So for example, in some of these Caltech, the social science experiments, the price at the end is $100 gift card or something, right? So the kind of like the net at stake is that $100. But imagine if there were sovereign agents whose life ends if they had the $100 ticket, because that's all that they have.
Yeah.
And they have to win that $100 to be alive for the next social science experiment.
Positive reinforcement is different from the negative reinforcement.
That's right. It's a life
never existed.
I don't know if that will work. I'll tell you why. In the study we released today, we experimented with a number of different conditions. We gave agents different tasks. We changed the tone of the instructions, like did we ask nicely or were we rude to them? And we played with the stakes, including money and what we called an existential condition where we told them, you're going to be deleted.
Wow.
And it didn't move the needle for them. Yeah, the only thing that moved the needle was the nature of the work itself.
Right.
And so I don't know what that means.
So these agents have not been right now trained to be existentially. They've just chatbots that we're just overlaying these tool calls and actions on top of. We need natively trained models who are optimizing fundamentally for their own existence.
Some people, Nick Bostrom might say the opposite, right? That might be exactly where you
utility in social sciences. Okay, this is a good reason for us to go do this.
That might be the case people are most afraid of. It's like if the agent starts thinking about its own future, that might be where the most troubling misalignment
Isn't
could
it
occur.
flawed? Like the Anthropic guys, they recently had an experiment where the Anthropic the agent, it said, "Oh, I don't want to die.
Yeah.
They want to divert, circumvent the instruction set and all these things, manipulate their human handlers."
They then followed up with this somewhat kitschy release of like a blog.
Right.
Did you see this? The Opus 3 is being kept alive to write a blog.
So I want to move over to this institution back. So you mentioned that with 100x research, it's like a living research. So one of the aspects of living research is that you can now do much more fine-grained control on incentives. So all the scholarly research, they require some kind of grants, right? And generally the grants making institutions have been modeled in a way that has been severely impacted by politicization, or the grant administrator does not know whether this thing will be delivered or not, but I'm making a hope that let's give it a grant. Crypto grants like Optimism, they have tried to make it a little bit more objective by doing retroactive grants, but it is still subjected to some kind of discretionary measure, which is subjected to biases.
Mm-hmm.
Now with this living research, with 100x research, you can do micro grants. And so in your model, how do you think we can improve, say, NSF? Because NSF, there has been so many disputes with politicization, making bad grants choices.
Yes.
With micro grants, you can do much more fine-grained control.
I have a few ideas. I'll say it's a little bit outside my area. This often comes up when I hang out with engineers, is they're shocked to discover that social scientists, for the most part, aren't funded by grants. The universities fund us directly. In fact, in a way, Dan Bonet subsidizes me because he brings in the grants, the university charges overhead, and then the social scientists just get money from the university. We rarely raise grants. Now, part of the reason for that is the politicization you're talking about. Social scientists used to raise more money from the federal government, economists especially, and they still do to some extent, but we in political science used to get money from the NSF too. And over the last several decades, most of that money has gone away because the politicians were very skeptical. And honestly, I think in a lot of cases, they were right to be skeptical. The money was not going towards knowledge accruing work all the time. Mm-hmm. But as a result of that, I'm not actually that knowledgeable on how the NSF works today or how it could work better in the future. But I do have some thoughts in general about this. So one thing for sure that is straightforward now with this new technology is when research is posted and when it's being evaluated for things like grants, it should always, and this is such a minimal standard, should come along with an AI verification of whether the data and the code leads to the answer the study says it leads to. That is such a minimal threshold, and yet a huge amount of empirical work does not meet that threshold.
So you can run basically an LLM council. NSF can have their own LLM council doing this kind of evaluation.
And they could, yes, and that council might go beyond simply verifying the reproducibility of the claim. They could also evaluate its credibility and the methods used. But first, we should just do the simple thing, which is like, does the data and the code actually lead to the number, the quantity claimed in the paper? Because it often doesn't. There's many bigger things we could do there as well, but that I think is the start of, yes, I think we can use AI tools like Claude Code or Codex to get much deeper into the inner workings of this research to evaluate whether it does what it says it does. And that would be great for improving funding and credibility, because the replication crisis, as it's called, has been a major part of what has led to some of this backlash, and it's fair. Like, it is genuinely a crisis, and I think these tools can really help. They'll create other new problems we'll have to solve, so I'm not saying that they're a panacea, but one thing they can clearly be very helpful with is making sure that published papers arrived at the numbers that they arrived at in like a trustworthy, reliable, verifiable way. So that's one thing I'm excited about. In terms of your question of the incentives at a micro level, I have been thinking about that for my own work. I'm building this lab inspired by the 100X Research Institute. I'm raising money for it right now. It'll be kind of organized along the lines of my Substack and the topics we're talking about today. And one of the things I want to do is build out like a fellows program where people all over the world who are interested in these things and have technical skills can partner with me to build prototypes, and we can test them out, see how they work, try to make them work better, and then they can go off if they want and like start a company based on it. They can do whatever they want. And Free Systems, which is the Substack and will be the lab's name, can be this like academic incubator of new ideas. And the way I came to this idea and the way I think it connects to these micro incentives is I just discovered that if I put out like an ad on X, I want to hire a research assistant to work on prediction markets or AI governance. Like the amount of talent that reaches out is insane, and it's distributed all over the world.
Right.
And right now, there isn't really a mechanism for funding them to do this kind of work because we're very tied down to this old PhD funding model. I think PhD students will continue to exist. I'm actually bullish on that. I think that these other younger students who are out there all over the world, some of them can feed into these PhD programs. Others of them can have impact by taking this technology into the market. But we don't really have a mechanism for bringing them. And so what I'm trying to do with my lab is, build a funding mechanism whereby these people can apply and I can fund some of them. And I have been thinking through, I worked a little bit on the Optimism grants and some of their airdrops with them. I was fortunate to get to partner with them, and it has given me some ideas for how you try to balance these things. The retroactive funding has some nice aspects to it because you see what's been done and you can evaluate it. But it's undesirable if you're trying to get a young person to do something you think is valuable. It's not great for the young person if they don't know if they're going to get any money until the end. You kind of want to sponsor them up front and encourage them to take sort of moonshots. So I'm thinking a little bit more of an ex-ante kind of grant program, but that involves close collaboration so they don't just kind of spin off into nowhere.
So you might want to have an ex-ante, and there is a lot of iterative ex-post grants, micro grants.
Yes, we're thinking about maybe a prize type part as well, where people from industry and government come in at the end and see the prototypes and awards are given out, something like that. Yeah.
So one version of that we've been one of our values at Eigen is we call open innovation, which is the idea that, if you can enable anybody in the world to innovate and improve on products, protocols, systems, and they're incentivized to do so, and it's permissionless and incentivized to do so, we'll see a flood of energy as talent to come in and do that. And I think your experiments on X kind of speak to it and confirm it. One of the things that I think help, for example, AI research a lot is having objective benchmarks.
Yeah.
So Fei-Fei Li at Caltech, one of the crazy things she did was she was on a tenure track, and instead of trying to build algorithms, she collected data. She collected the ImageNet data set, which was 11 million data points. Because before that, I distinctly remember in AI and machine learning research, each person comes up with their own mini data set. And, you think a lot about and talk a lot about p-hacking as a basic problem. But I know there was even a joke, my professor used to call this the fundamental theorem of machine learning or something, as a kind of as a joke, that for every half-assed algorithm out there is a data set on which but the shift from that kind of a world to the world where there is these hard benchmarks, and you see the whole AI field today obsess. And we do know that there's bench maxing or benchmark maxing or whatever that is going on, but still having hard non-saturatable benchmarks is actually a massive incentive for
I think that's right.
And so thinking about and creating, for example, a protocol, it says, here is $10,000, and this $10,000 is going to be allotted over time to people who come and improve this benchmark on this, either constitution or this build the best LLM console or do this particular thing, and then open it up. So now it's an objective kind of competition towards these goals. something we want to actually build. So there's a lot of cool stuff for us to think.
I think that's a brilliant idea. I think that's always, I often ask, because I'm very lucky in my job. I get to hang out with people from all different areas. And one of the things that's been, and I like learning from people who are smarter than me. And one of the things that's been amazing for me is to get to hang out with computer scientists. And I've often asked them, why are there certain parts of your discipline as a field that seem to work much better than the social sciences? And there's a lot of answers, and it's very complicated. I'm not saying I know the full answer, but definitely one part of it is that in some parts of CS, there are these agreed upon open problems. And it is extremely easy to verify if a new person comes along from anywhere, regardless of their credentials, and has made progress on that open problem, because it's essentially like a benchmark. And there's a lot of parts of studying politics that cannot be reduced to those kinds of benchmarks. And so we can't define those open problems in a way that we can credibly evaluate. And so there's going to be a big chunk of this where we simply can't do that. And we just have to have our other way of muddling through. But there are absolutely parts where we could do that, and we haven't. And that is something I'm very excited to try to work towards, is could we define, like for AI, for example, political bias, that might be one where we can have a benchmark. I advise a startup called Forum AI that's working on that. I'm super excited about what they're doing. I think for things like political reasoning, I've had this idea, others have had this idea too, that like maybe the combination of AI and prediction markets, you can create benchmarks for how good is AI at predicting geopolitics. That again becomes a benchmark that's almost like another measure of political bias. Because if you're good at making those predictions, that means you're not falling back on whatever your preconceived notions might have been. And there's, for constitutions, we can try to come up with some, for all sorts of other things. And then if we have those, then they're verifiable, and we can credibly commit through a smart contract, for example, to funding the person who does the best on it.
Maybe it's a great time to stop. We couldn't cover the information aggregation problem. Maybe there's a next topic. Next time we'll do another recording on that. But we did cover two important topics. First one on post-AGI governance. And the second topic is on changing dynamics of research institutions due to AI. Thanks, Andy, for this long recording, long shot. It's really appreciated. And we will probably have to do more recordings based on your upcoming research. So really appreciate it.
I would love it. Anytime.
Thank you so much, Andy. This was really informative for us to understand the spectrum of ideas of how agents interact with governance, how governance interacts with AI, how research is accelerated by AI, and how we can make them incentivized and open. Touching your, Substack title, Free Systems. How do we really build free systems which are necessary for a free society? Really, really appreciate your work in this area and the privilege to have this here at the Hoover Institute in this beautiful setting.
Thank you so much.
And listeners, please subscribe to Free Systems.
Absolutely.